There are parts of us we learn to hide even before we understand why. When a child is scolded for laughing too loudly, for speaking their mind without a filter, or for showing emotions too intensely, they don't realize those things are part of who they are. They just learn they're not allowed to show them. And little by little, the world becomes a distorted mirror. What gets praised is reinforced. What causes discomfort is pushed aside, buried deep within the soul as if it never existed. But it's still there. That's how the shadow begins, as everything that was denied for being too much or not enough in the eyes of others. The most curious thing is that the shadow isn't made only of destructive impulses or shameful desires. It also holds what could have blossomed, talents, vital impulses, legitimate desires, but was smothered in the name of superficial acceptance. It's the sensitivity that was labeled weakness, the creativity silenced out of fear of seeming strange, the courage mistaken for rebellion. Early on, we learn that being accepted is safer than being whole. And so we begin stacking pieces of ourselves in the backstage of consciousness. Whatever doesn't fit the image the world expects, we hide. And the more we try to appear proper, polite, functional, the further we drift from the spontaneity that once gave color to our presence. The shadow is born, then, not as malice, but as a reflection of a society that shapes us by what it rejects, not just by what it allows. Ignoring the shadow doesn't make it go away, it just makes it better at hiding. It starts to show up in the details, in words that slip out, in decisions we make without knowing why, in the discomfort we feel in spaces where everyone else seems fine. It's like there's another presence inside us, one that acts, chooses, and responds before we even realize it. Over time, we begin to move more slowly, not out of laziness, but out of excessive caution. It's as if something in us feels too much, wounds too easily, needs silence to understand what the world says without words. And in this effort not to disturb, not to be too much, to fit into the space we were given, we start to retreat. We don't shout. We don't demand. We just adapt. And in that delicate survival mode, we start to drift away from who we could have become. There's a subtle difference between being accepted and being authentic, but it changes everything. When we spend our lives trying to please, we accumulate small internal betrayals. We stop following strong intuitions, we silence creative impulses, we avoid confrontations that could have set us free. And the most painful part is realizing, one day, that we no longer know who we are without someone else's gaze. That our potential wasn't lost, it just fell asleep beneath layers of caution, fear, and silence. It's common to look back and feel we lacked courage. But it wasn't always fear. Many times, it was simply heightened perception. We sensed the environment, the judgments, the unspoken expectations, and we shaped ourselves around it as a form of protection. But the price was high. In shielding ourselves from the world, we also shielded ourselves from ourselves. What could have been strength became absence. What began as impulse turned into doubt. Personal growth doesn't begin with big decisions. It begins with small permissions. Permission to think differently. Permission not to comply. Permission to want something that can't be explained. The path back to ourselves isn't linear nor immediate, but it exists. And it begins the moment we realize it wasn't the world that stopped us from being more. It was us, slowly tuning out the voice of our own soul. Inside each of us, there's a carefully constructed version, polished, understandable, socially acceptable. We learn to keep that image steady because it protects us. But there's also what we left out. What doesn't fit, what feels odd or uncomfortable, gets left behind. Not consciously, but as an automatic gesture of adaptation. That's where the shadow begins. The shadow, as Jung described it, is not what we know about ourselves. It's what we can't see. It's made up of everything excluded from our self-image. And the more we identify with that social construction, the denser our inner darkness becomes. The shadow isn't a mistake nor a flaw. It's simply the other side of what we chose to show. Living between this visible image and what's been excluded is exhausting. Because the more we try to seem complete, the more we fear what's hidden in the dark. And even if it feels safer to keep this contrast intact, the cost is high. A disconnection from wholeness, from spontaneity, from the quiet truth that pulses behind what we try to appear to be. This internal fragmentation creates a kind of autopilot living. We repeat patterns, respond to stimuli, pretend we're at peace, but something inside keeps stirring, trying to get our attention. When the shadow goes unacknowledged, it finds ways to express itself without our permission. And sometimes that shows up as anxiety, suppressed anger, existential fatigue, or even a numbness that drains the meaning from our days. Life, then, loses its nuance. Everything becomes a sequence of completed tasks, superficial relationships, and goals that lack meaning. Vitality fades, not from a lack of energy, but from a lack of connection. Because as long as parts of us are rejected, the soul continues to fragment, and no amount of structured routine will be enough to heal that. To understand this internal split, Jung proposed a broader view of the mind. We are not just consciousness. There are deep layers working silently, the personal unconscious, the collective, the archetypes, the instinctive impulses. And among these forces lies the shadow, the part that holds everything we were taught not to be. Consciousness is only a fragment of who we are. The rest lives behind our gestures, beneath our choices, underneath our words. And the most striking realization is that even what we think we've chosen might have been shaped by forces we don't even know. The shadow lives there, like a repository of sensations, memories, and forgotten impulses. The process of individuation, the term Jung used to describe real maturity, requires a plunge. It's not about following formulas, but about listening to what's been silenced, about reflecting with courage, about approaching what was left behind. It's in this psychic territory, full of nuance and contradiction, that self-knowledge stops being a concept and becomes transformation. There's no fixed map, but there is a calling, and it almost always comes from what we try hardest not to see. Many still believe the shadow only contains what is dark or bad, as if it's a hidden corner of the soul, filled with shameful desires and destructive impulses. But the shadow also holds a spark, that part of us that was silenced for being too intense, too spontaneous, too free. The sensitivity labeled as exaggeration, the curiosity that frightened others, the courage that didn't fit the mold. Integrating the shadow means recognizing that there's beauty in who we've become, but also pain in who we didn't get to be. It's not about accepting everything without a filter, it's about giving voice to what was denied. Wholeness is born in this space, in the honest blend of strength and vulnerability, sweetness and rage, reason and instinct. We don't always realize how much we're being guided by what we repress. Sometimes a seemingly rational decision hides an old fear. An emotional distance reveals a desire we didn't know how to handle. The shadow acts behind the gesture, shaping decisions that seem normal on the surface, but run deep beneath. It affects our relationships, our desires, our priorities. An old belief about not being worthy can show up as self-sabotage in love. A silenced feeling can leak out as sarcasm, rigidity, or exhaustion. And the curious thing is that, from the outside, everything seems under control, but on the inside, that's where the noise happens. In how we treat ourselves, in how we respond to affection, in the refusal to occupy spaces we secretly long for. Living without recognizing this influence is like walking with a mirror covered. We feel the reflections, but don't know where they come from. And so, we make choices that lead us away from what would actually make sense. not out of malice, but from inattention. And deep down, we know. We sense that something is off, but we can't name it. That's why the shadow needs to be heard, because it speaks. And when welcomed with respect, it reveals more about us than any polished image ever could. It's not just the individual who represses. Societies build their own masks too, models of success, of beauty, of normality. And they reject everything that doesn't fit those molds. The collective shadow is born from this, as everything an entire group chooses not to see. When it erupts, it comes in the form of intolerance, polarization, hysteria. The social persona, like the individual one, becomes sick when it tries to suppress what is genuine. From an early age, we learn what's right or wrong based on these constructs. We inherit fears, prejudices, and patterns of thought as if they were truths. Culture shapes what we exclude in ourselves, and often, what we repress wasn't rejected because it was dangerous, but because it was misunderstood by those around us. The danger lies in living within these boundaries without ever questioning them, in believing the world is only what we've been shown. But freedom begins when we realize there's something beyond the constructed image, and that to reach it we need courage, not just to look within, but also to see what's around us. The persona we show the world is like clothing. It's been stitched together over time based on what we've learned is acceptable, praised, and valued. In many moments, it's protected us, served as a bridge. But when we confuse ourselves with it, we forget it's just a cover. Beneath it, entire parts still exist, alive, whole, and silenced, waiting for space. Behind the persona are whole parts of ourselves that were never allowed to exist, not because they were wrong, but because they didn't fit the costume we were taught to wear. The problem begins when we believe we are only that adjusted version, because while the persona holds up the appearance of completeness, the shadow pulses with everything we left unlived. It screams silently, reminding us that authenticity doesn't live in performance. It lives in wholeness. It takes gentleness not to resent the persona that once protected us, but also courage not to keep hiding behind it. The more we cling to what we present, the further we drift from what we feel. Living only on the surface may feel comfortable, but it comes at a high cost: the distance from ourselves. There are moments when we surprise ourselves with our own reactions. A sharp word, a thoughtless gesture, a silence that stings. And afterward, the guilt, the shock. As if something slipped out of our control. That's the shadow in motion, not as a threat, but as a buildup. Repressed emotions don't disappear. They wait. And all it takes is a crack, a frustration, a glass of wine, an unspoken hurt, for them to break through the limits of the persona. The greater the repression, the more intense the rupture. Not because we're bad, but because we're human, and the soul can't bear being ignored for too long. Recognizing this doesn't mean justifying harmful behavior. It means understanding that there's a cry for integration, that behind the outburst, there's a part of us that just wants to be heard. Sometimes we can't stand certain people, and we don't even know why. A tone of voice, a gesture, some trait that irritates us. And almost always we think the problem is in them. But what wounds us is often the reflection. The shadow finds mirrors in the places we least expect. We project what we can't accept in ourselves. The arrogance we criticize might be unacknowledged pride. The fragility we judge in others might be our own stifled sensitivity. Every intense discomfort is an invitation to look within. It's uncomfortable to admit that what we see in others also lives in us. But recognizing that is freeing. It breaks the cycle of denial. It gathers what we scattered across other people's faces. It's a slow process, but deeply transformative. The shadow stops being an enemy and becomes a bridge. Not everything that was silenced deserved to be shut down. Many parts of us, spontaneous, curious, sensitive, were pushed aside not because they were dangerous, but because they had no room to bloom. And what exhausts us isn't always the routine itself, but the effort of keeping shut the doors that once led us to joy. Holding up a rigid persona is exhausting. It demands constant control, forced presence, emotional surveillance. And the more we try to seem balanced, the more disconnected we become from what's real. The shadow might seem like a burden, but often it holds the key to vitality. Only those who allow themselves to be whole can rediscover the joy of simply existing without performing. Integration doesn't mean unleashing impulses without awareness. It means listening to what hurts without censorship. It's asking, what is this reaction trying to show me? What part of me is being ignored when I feel jealous, when I react harshly, when I compare myself? Integration requires presence, not in the sense of controlling everything, but in embracing without running, in allowing what acts in the shadows to have a voice and be understood consciously. And paradoxically, the more we integrate, the lighter we become. The weight doesn't come from the shadow, but from the refusal to acknowledge it. When we stop fighting what we feel, the energy once trapped in repression begins to flow. Authenticity is born from this radical honesty, accepting our own contradictions. And this, far from weakening us, makes us more human. To be whole is not to be perfect, it's to be true. It's to look at our flaws without shame and our virtues without arrogance. We don't need to eliminate what hurts. We need to stop running from it, because healing can only happen where there's room for everything we are. Authentic people have something rare. They don't live to impress. They don't apologize for existing. And for that very reason, they are trustworthy. The experience of being with them is unforgettable, because they give us permission to let our guard down, to be real too. The kind of goodness that comes from wholeness runs deeper. It doesn't need to be recognized. It rises from within with strength, freedom, and kindness. In this light, the shadow is not an obstacle. It's contrast, because only those who know their own limits can truly choose to walk with integrity. The shadow rarely reveals itself clearly. It prefers to hide in the details, in reactions that slip out, in impulsive judgments, in irritation that has no clear cause. Often, it's in what bothers us about others that the shadow makes itself known. That trait we can't tolerate, that behavior that drives us crazy, all of it could be a reflection of what we still haven't accepted in ourselves. Observing our own triggers is an act of honesty. Asking why something affects us so deeply takes courage. And almost always, the answer leads inward, to an old wound, a forgotten pain, a part of us left on the margins, trying to be heard. The shadow speaks with emotional force. It shows up when something pulls us out of neutrality, and in that break, we have the chance to finally listen to what hasn't yet been integrated. Mapping this isn't simple. It takes presence, awareness, constant attention to what we feel. But little by little, the patterns begin to reveal themselves. The repetitions take on meaning, and what once was noise becomes a path. The shadow stops being a threat and becomes a signal, an invitation to reconnect. If there's pain in this hidden territory, there is also strength. Unlived desires, shelved wants, instincts waiting to be expressed. All of this energy doesn't need to be suppressed. It needs to be understood. Anger might point to a boundary that's been ignored. Envy to a dream that's fallen asleep. Wounded pride to a forgotten talent. When we begin to see what we once judged, we make room for transformation. Channeling that energy is a conscious act. It's not about giving in to impulse, but about transforming it into creation, decision, change. When welcomed with wisdom, the shadow becomes power. A flame that once burned in silence, now able to warm, illuminate, and protect. To truly love someone is to accept even the parts that are not easy. And that applies inward too. Self-compassion doesn't come from perfection, but from accepting imperfection. It's the gesture of saying to yourself, even with what still hurts, even with what I don't fully understand, I recognize myself here. The kind of love that transforms doesn't demand edited versions. It allows presence, silence, and flaws. It allows you to simply be. And when we find that love, whether in someone else or within ourselves, we realize we no longer need to hide so many parts. And that freedom, even if quiet, changes everything. Facing your own shadow may be the deepest challenge of existence. It doesn't require external strength, but inner courage. The kind that stays silent. The kind that watches. The kind that holds discomfort without running from it. It's a slow path, sometimes a lonely one, but it's the one that brings us back to wholeness. As long as we avoid that meeting, we will live divided, between what we show and what we hide, between what we feel and what we pretend not to notice. True transformation doesn't come from becoming perfect, it comes from no longer fighting against our own truth. The shadow, when integrated, doesn't weaken us, it makes us whole. If you've made it this far, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and check out my exclusive ebook. It's pinned in the first comment below.